Hello, it's Shari. Today I'm going to be making this card with a custom sentiment and an inked image. This card is based on a mug that sits on my desk given to me by my friend Jennifer that says you make the world a better place. So to start with, I'm going to take a piece of distress watercolor cardstock and I'm cutting it in half so that I have two smaller pieces. I'm going to be doing some ink smushing on these pieces, and I've picked out 3 shades of green to start with. I'm going to be making a green piece and a blue piece. I want to start with my lightest color, so this is Twisted Citron. I've just smushed that onto my craft mat and I'm going to add some water. So I'm going to flip this piece of cardstock over, or watercolor paper I should say, and pick up that ink. Then I'm going to use my heat tool to dry it. So I'm going to be doing a lot of drying between the layers, and this is what gives you that texture and those different layers. Now I'm going to move on to Mowed Lawn and do the same thing. You can see this is a much darker color. I actually had some parts that were a little too concentrated. I hadn't really gotten good water coverage on there. And you can see that I can take my spray bottle and spray directly onto the paper to kind of loosen up that ink and stretch it out a little bit with the water since it was just concentrated. It gets rid of those really dark specks. And then finally, I'm going to do some Lucky Clover Distress ink. And I'm trying to keep these kind of on the edges or spotty rather than doing this color all over. And that way you still see those layers of the Twisted Citron and the Mowed Lawn come through as well. Now to move on to the blue piece. So again, I'm going to start with my lightest color, which is Tumbled Glass. I'm going to put a lot of that on my craft mat and add some water. And again, with this lightest color, I'm going to try to get coverage across this whole piece. Then I'm going to move on to my middle color, which is Broken China. I'm just going to pick that up and continue to dry it between the layers. You can see how this gives you the texture when you dry it and then pick up more ink. And then finally, my last color is Mermaid Lagoon. And this is a much darker color. This one doesn't have as many little splatters as my green ended up having. So I'm going to be adding some spray in Distress Oxides. So I thought I'd try my speckled egg. I haven't played with this one yet, but it was a little too muted for what I wanted. So I'm going to move on to some Mermaid Lagoon Oxide spray. So this is going to match that last color of Distress ink that I added. And this one gave me the look that I wanted. So I'm holding it up pretty high so that I get little droplets of that ink. And I'm using an oxide spray, so it's going to have kind of that more chalky, less translucent look. So I wanted to create some finished edge to these, so I'm going to line it up with the very edge of a outside in. This is the largest outside in rectangle, and cut it so I was stitching on 3 sides. I did the same thing to the green panel, and then now I'm going to take a stitched hillside to create the curve of my globe that I'm creating. I want that same curve on the green, so I'm going to line up what I cut with the blue, and then I'm going to snug that die up to the edge of it, and I can use that tape to hold it in place and just remove the blue panel. So now that I've got my 2 panels here, I'm going to take my pencil and just sketch in a wavy line that's suggestive of the continents on the earth. So this is not geographically correct, but it's going to be close enough to where you get the idea of what we're trying to do here. And then I'm just going to take my scissors and trim that out. And I'll just take an eraser and erase those pencil lines. And then I'm going to darken up the edges so that this is defined from the blue and it sort of pops. So darkening up the edges is just a fun trick that allows you to get some dimension between your pieces. I'm going to do the same thing to the blue. I'm using Lucky Clover for the green, and I'm going to use that Mermaid Lagoon for the edge of the blue. I'm just doing the top edge of this. And you can see how it sort of gives it more definition than the other edges. Now to work on the sentiment. I'm using Smitty's ABCs for this one, and I've cut a piece of blue Jay cardstock with that same outside in rectangle so everything matches. And I've just got it in my MISTI with that blue piece as a placeholder so I can see the spacing. I'm going to start with the word U at the top, and since this is 3 letters, I know that O is right in the center. And I'm just going to line up my letters on my cardstock and pick it up with the MISTI door. Now, I did a couple different methods of lining up letters on this card. So this is how I started, but lining them up like that isn't really the best way to do it for every line. So you're going to see a couple different methods. Just do what works for you. So I've added some anti-static powder to my background there, and I'm going to use some clear embossing ink. I'm going to stamp that word down, and then I'm going to add some white embossing powder. Now I'm not going to heat set it just yet. I'm going to stamp a couple other lines, but I should have heat set between each one, and I'll tell you why. So I'm going in with the next word, which is make, and I've put it on a block. And the reason why I did that is I felt like I could center it up under the word U a lot better by moving it around on a block than I could putting it on the MISTI door. I also didn't want to bump that embossing powder and knock it off the word U. Now for the next line, it says the world, and I knew that that W was in the middle, so it was easy to put that W in the center, pick it up with the door of the MISTI, and now I can easily line up all those other letters because they're on those square bases. So they're really easy to line up once you know where one of them goes. Now, part of the reason why I decided to go ahead and start heat setting things is because I added some embossing, or some anti-static for this stamping, and I knocked part of my embossing powder off of the word make. So I had to quickly add that back. So you're going to see that after I did this one, I'm going to go ahead and start heat setting these. I wasn't being as careful as I normally am. So I'm adding that white embossing powder to the stamp of the world, and I'm going to go ahead and heat set these 3 lines that I've already done. Now if I add some more anti-static, I'm not going to run the risk of knocking off my embossing powder. If I had put that anti-static all over in the first place, I wouldn't have had that problem, but I did not. That was a mistake that I made. But you can see now I can add it and it doesn't matter. I'm not going to knock anything off. So I put the words "a better," and again I did this one on a block. For me, it was easier to line up the lowercase letters on a block than it was to line it up on the MISTI door. But again, just do what works for you. I'm going to add that white embossing powder, go ahead and heat set that one, and then I'll move on to the last word. This one was again all capital letters. There were 5 of them, so I knew the A was in the center, and that was easy to line up where I wanted it, pick it up with the MISTI door, and then I can put those other letters in place. So I'm using that clear embossing ink again. I'm going to stamp it down, add my white embossing powder, and heat set that, and then this custom sentiment is all finished. And I love mixing the uppercase and lowercase. It gives it a really cool look without changing the font. Now my little trick for getting the anti-static off of dark cardstock is just to run a damp chamois over it. So I've got that off. I had a little bit of stray embossing powder, so I'm using a sand eraser, but I'm not too concerned because I'm going to add some stars to this. So I'm going in with some black soot distress ink to darken up the top so that this isn't all one color of blue, gives it more depth. And that white embossing that I've already done on the sentiment is just going to resist that ink. So I can go in with a dry paper towel and just buff that ink off of that white embossing. I also used some Distress Oxide for the very corners. When I was playing with these to see which looked better, the Oxide or the regular, it kind of gave it a different look. So I'm just doing the corners there. It's a lot darker. It may be hard to see on camera, but there was a slight difference. Now I'm going to use some white metallic watercolor to create some stars in my galaxy above the globe that I've created. And I'm going to flick this off the side of a clear block, and this will make those droplets very tiny and look a lot like stars. Now I can put together those watercolored pieces that I've done at the bottom. I'm just going to glue the green directly to the blue, and since I use those dies to cut the same shape, they're going to line up perfectly. Now I can add this to the bottom of that panel of the galaxy that I created. And everything has that nice stitching detail all the way around the four edges. So I've added a lot of foam tape to the back of this panel, and I'm going to mount this onto a card base created from some rainforest cardstock. So this is kind of similar in color, but I didn't want that bright white of a card. It still kind of has that dark space look, but just a slightly different color to create a matte. And then finally, I'm adding a tiny little die cut heart cut from some Guava Cardstock right to the bottom below my sentiment. And then I'm going to add some stardust stickles to that so it's glittery. And then that is my finished card. I hope you've enjoyed watching how I made this card with my alphabet stamps. It's another in the series of cards I've been making using my alphabet stamps to make uplifting sentiments that I think everyone needs to hear. Thanks for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.